Her working experience now, Dr. Michelle is pursuing her research interest in TB drug discovery. Okay, without further ado, I would like to invite Dr. Michelle to deliver her talk. Thank you, Dr. Michelle. Please.
Thank you. Okay, so I hope everyone can see my screen and can hear me clearly. Thank you very much for the invitation to the webinar. I'm happy to be able to present the presentation slides for today, which is the implementation of nationwide tuberculosis whole genome sequencing in Singapore. This is the experience that the National Public Health Laboratory we had setting up this laboratory workflow in our laboratory. So just to give a brief introduction, TB in Singapore. So tuberculosis was actually prevalent in Singapore up until the 1970s. And we have a sizable number of older people in Singapore that have latent TB because of the history. And since 2006, the TB incidence rate in Singapore has remained between 30 to 40 per 100,000 people. And it actually remains an endemic disease in Singapore. So this is something to keep into consideration when we actually implement whole genome sequencing in the country, nationwide whole genome sequencing. Furthermore, while drug resistance and multi-drug resistance TB cases are not at very high rates, we still need to be aware that we have the threat of MDR TB at its national borders, as we are surrounded by quite a few countries that have higher rates of MDR and DR TB. So here I present some statistics for Singapore. We can see that the number of TB cases in Singapore over the years, sorry, just let me activate the laser. Yeah, the number of TB cases over the years in Singapore has actually remained quite stagnant. In fact, the number of cases have actually decreased a little bit over the years. And as you can see, a sizable number, as I mentioned, a lot of the older people in our generation, in our country, actually have actually TB. So to illustrate the point on that we have the threat of MDR TB at its borders, you can see that from this data that shows the drug susceptibility patterns of TB cases in residents versus non-residents, and you can see that for non-residents, they generally have higher rates of drug resistance and multi-drug resistant cases. So the objectives of whole genome sequencing in Singapore was actually to replace the low to mid-resolution genotyping methods. In other words, for TB, it's currently what was previously being used was the 24 Miru VNTR and oligotyping. And these were considered as low or to mid-resolution genotyping methods. So implementing whole genome sequencing was one way to replace these existing methods. It was also to do genomic surveillance of genomic prediction of TB drug resistance, and to perform genomic surveillance of the circulating tuberculosis lineages and multi-drug resistance and extensively drug-resistant TB cases. And also by implementing whole genome sequencing, there's a potential to detect transmission clusters and outbreaks that are not detected by the usual means of contact tracing for TB, etc. And also to support the contact tracing activities and the epidemiological investigations that are created by the National TB Program in Singapore. And along the way, we have also found that whole genome sequencing has actually been useful to answer certain other questions that were previously not so well resolved by conventional laboratory methods, such as answering the questions on whether could there have been mixed infections for a particular TB case? Could there have been treatment failure cases to identify or differentiate a relapse versus a reinfection case? And also to answer potential questions about BCG vaccine complications. So I will just give a brief history on how the TB WGS was actually set up in Singapore. It actually started off as a research project at the beginning based on a few research grants that were actually used for pilot TB whole genome sequencing. And back then, it actually went as far back as 2014, whereby selected TB DNA samples were actually sent to research to these organizations, the Polaris and A-Star, which are actually more research-focused organizations for whole genome sequencing. And the bioinformatics analysis was actually performed by the NUS Public School of Health. And as they started to gain momentum and send select TB DNA samples, and when they proved proof of use, and they actually managed to solve certain outbreaks that had happened in Singapore, which I will go into detail later on. And as they started to prove the utility of whole genome sequencing, in 2019, towards the end of 2019, they started to shift the program towards a more national-based front. So that was when NPHL started to take over the wet lab sequencing component. So the central TB lab, so there are actually two TB labs, two main labs in Singapore that do diagnostic TB. So the first lab, Central TB Lab, actually started to send selected TB DNA samples to NPHL for whole genome sequencing. So this was actually on a mainly retrospective basis. So it was a very gradual ramp up. And as we started to process more samples and realized that, okay, we could handle the volume, we started to accept samples from NUH TB Lab as well. In the following year. And all these initially were all based on selection criteria of MDR cases or suspect drug-resistant cases that required, more clinical use, required, more clinical intervention, and also for suspect TB clusters that the National TB Program was investigating. So initially it was all based on selection, and then as we gradually ramped up and sequenced, and NPHL also started to take over the bioinformatics analysis during this phase. And when it came to by Q4 2020, the MIRU, which was the previous genotyping method that was used for TB, was actually phased out, and eventually all TB isolates were sent to NPHL for whole genome sequencing and bioinformatics analysis. So yes, NPHL has been sequencing all these since 2020, since the end of 2020 to the present. And to date, we have sequenced about 4,000 over isolates and counting. So this is the operational workflow that was set up. So as I mentioned, that there are actually only 2 TB labs in Singapore that can handle diagnostic cases. There is the Central TB Laboratory that is actually based at the Singapore General Hospital. And there's also the NUH Tuberculosis Lab, which is based at the National University of Hospital. So these 2 labs will actually perform their standard, diagnostic laboratory workflows. And when there are culturable TB cases, they will actually go on to extract the DNA and send the sample to NPHL for whole genome sequencing. And along with that, the labs also send us whatever available phenotypic drug susceptibility test results they have at that time to us, as this enables us to select, because whole genome sequencing, we run it on batches. So sometimes we need to prioritize, which cases are more urgent to sequence. So we would select based on the available phenotypic DST profiles, the suspect drug-resistant cases. And we'll do the whole genome sequencing. And in return, we would return the genomic drug susceptibility testing prediction results and the clustering and SNP analysis results to the National TB Program, and also to the TB control unit, which is the clinical arm of the NTBP unit. And so this National TB Program has oversight of all the clinical information and the epidemiological information of all these cases, and they will put together the cluster analysis results and the genomic DST results to see what's the best way to go forward to use the results. So for all suspect drug-resistant cases, they will forward the results to the clinicians that are involved in treatment. For the clustering results, for any clusters that are detected, they will go on to do further epidemiological investigations, which I will go into later on. So this is the laboratory workflow that is set up at our laboratory. As I mentioned, the DNA is actually extracted in the BSL3 facilities at the Central TB Laboratory and the NUH-TB lab. The DNA is then sent over to NPHL, where we will start off by preparing whole genome sequencing libraries. This process usually takes about 1 to 2 days. And then the samples are put into the sequencer, which currently we are using a MySeq, Illumina MySeq system. And this will take on average about 55 hours. So we would say it's about 2 to 3 days. And then we'll go on to do the bioinformatics analysis. And depending on what the analysis is to be done, the time periods would differ. So currently now we are actually running the whole genome sequencing for TB on generally a weekly basis. So to go in a little bit on the technical details, so basically for bioinformatics analysis, we're actually extracting the raw reads from the sequencing machine, mapping them to the reference genome, and then we perform variant calling. And this follows 2 separate bioinformatics pipelines. But before we go into the pipelines, we actually do a quality check. And any samples or any isolates that have poor Q30 scores, which basically it's just a metric to check the sequencing quality. So if they have poor Q30 scores, if they have low sequencing depth, because if you're familiar with whole genome sequencing, you have to sequence your samples and cover a certain number of times in order to get a certain number of confidence. So for samples which have low sequencing depth, and also samples which have been suspected or detected as non-tuberculosis mycobacteria, which can occur, I would say not infrequently, because it's a TB lab after all. So they process and handle all NTMs and TB as well. And also for samples that are contaminated with non-tuberculosis reads, for all these samples that have any of these criteria, we will actually remove them from the subsequent analysis workflow, because including these samples, will actually basically they are actually not fit for reporting. So after which we select the samples that have passed QC, they go to 2 different pipelines, as I mentioned. We have the clustering bioinformatics pipeline, whereby samples, this is more for the epidemiological investigations. And then there's the lineage and genomic DST prediction, which is more for the drug susceptibility predictions. So I will be going into detail for both. So we have shown that the whole genome sequencing results can have actually been used for a number of ways. And here you can see this is actually the setup that we have at NPHL. We do all analysis on this HPC standalone computer, and the results actually can be used for, like I said, they can be used for lineage classification, which is a very low resolution form of genotyping. And you can go further down to do detection of whole genome sequencing clusters, and also to do the genomic DST prediction. And we have also used it to identify different BCG vaccine strains as well. So I will go into the first component, which is for TB drug resistance prediction. And there are really mainly 3 main objectives here. The firstly is to complement the existing lab diagnostic methods to guide the clinical decisions, to perform MDR and XDR surveillance, and also to do, by collecting phenotypic and genotypic information, you can actually do PDST, GDST correlation. So this is the bioinformatics pipeline that we are going into. So basically, after the variant calling of the whole genome sequencing data, we perform annotation. And this is actually compared to the existing TBDB, which is actually a publicly available TB drug resistance library that has all the a catalog of all the existing TB drug resistance mutations that are known. And then we go on to report the lineage and drug resistance variants for each case. So this is an example of the genomic DST prediction report that is sent out to, that is returned to the National TB Program, and also returned to the submitting diagnostic labs. So you can see, for example, basically we give NPHL ID, the predicted drug resistance type, and the different mutations that are detected by the pipeline. And along this, we also provide what we call confidence scores, as we know that for TB drug mutations, there are certain mutations which are very well known and very well categorized and understood, but there are also new mutations that are being picked up that have less confidence that are associated with it. So we based our confidence based on these references. Yeah, so as I said, these are the mutations that are reported, for example, for a multi-drug resistant isolate. So what it really means, because as scientists, maybe this is quite understandable, but to the epidemiological team, sometimes we have to break these results down into more understandable terms for them. So what it really means is that, for example, for the H, sorry, these are actually the different drug types. This is isoniazid, rifampicin, pyrazinamide, ethambutol, and streptomycin. So these 4 HRZE are actually the first line drugs that are actually used for TB treatment, if you're familiar with TB. And then these are the mutations that we report. So for example, for this particular isolate, it has what we call a FABG1 C-15C T. So this actually refers to a point mutation in the INHA gene promoter. So that is and INHA is actually one of the genes that's involved in drug resistance mutation. But basically, the main point is that to a clinician, they might not get it, but we actually this is actually missing a confidence score. We usually assign a confidence score to every mutation that is reported so that there is some level of confidence for them to be able to guide their decisions in clinical making. And if necessary, they will also be in contact with us to discuss further about each mutation. And this one is actually a CAT gene mutation. So this is involved in rifampicin resistance. So this is a deletion in it's a deletion in a certain number of base, in about 20 base pairs in the CAT G gene, and this leads to a frame shift mutation due to this deletion. And then this isolate also carries so this is the one that this type of mutations are what we see most often, which are the amino acid substitution. So basically there might be a base pair change that has led to a change in the amino acid. And so this is the original amino acid, and it has been changed to a valine for this particular case at amino acid position 306. And this is actually a high confidence mutation. And we also have mutations that can occur in non-coding genes, so that would not lead to an amino acid substitution. And in such cases, we would denote as such. So we're actually just following the standard IUPAC naming function abbreviation. So as I mentioned, the confidence scoring is actually based on a certain number of references. So we are actually currently using the so when this was set up, which was way before 2021. We first relied on the World Health Organization 2018 catalog. So they had actually came up with a catalog to describe some of the well-known mutations that are associated with drug resistance in TB. And then this is later on further updated to include the 2021 version, whereby they actually added more drugs beyond just the first line, and also expanded the catalog to cover a lot more mutations. So this is actually has been extremely useful in the confidence scoring. And moreover, this is also based on some other, on the TBDB confidence database. As I mentioned, this database is actually publicly available. So there is also a confidence scoring that is associated with that. And we also based some of our own criteria, which is our own experience, basically, because I think the reason behind this is because some of the mutations that are reported, that are very well reported, are mutations that you see that are very well reported in the European and American countries, but in Asia, because the reporting is maybe the publications and reporting is less, some of these drug mutations are actually not as well known. So these are actually more mutations that are more common in the Southeast Asia region, which may not actually be updated or so well known in the WHO catalogs, because if they are not reported in the literature, basically they will not be captured. So the criteria is based on association of the mutation with the phenotypic drug resistance, including the frequency of mutation. the amount of evidence that is available for this mutation to be associated with drug resistance. So this evidence is curated based on the amount of public literature available, and also at our internal database as we start to collect more and more information and data on the, the 4,000 over isolates that we've sequenced. And it's also based on the MIC distribution, because we do know that phenotypic DST can have impacts, based on the MIC distribution. So, and all these references together with the criteria lead to the drug resistance, what we create, the drug resistance confidence database, and that leads to the NPHL confidence score. So this is really an amalgamation, a mixture of, the references and the information and data that we have available and we built up over the years. So along with our reporting, because if you notice, what we mentioned is prediction, because at the end of the day, genotypic does not necessarily translate to what we see phenotypically. We always highlight that, there are certain caveats for this prediction because they are just based on genotypic prediction. So we do report the drug resistance mutations observed for HRZE, which is the first 4 line, as I mentioned, and also for streptomycin and fluoroquinolones, as these are more clinically relevant, used in Singapore for TB treatment. And although we are able to, detect drug mutations for other TB drugs as well, the second line and so on, and the alternative drug, the aminoglycosides, PAS, bedaquiline, although we have this, to keep the workflow reporting simplified, and also as not to over confuse the clinicians, because many times these are not relevant to the particular cases that we're talking about. We do not actually report this all the mutations for all the drug targets, but rather those that are highlighted in blue, and the ones in gray, these are only reported for special cases. And also for rifampicin resistant isolates, because in Singapore, if they are RIF-R, they are actually usually taken as suspect multi-drug resistant TB cases. So for these cases, we will also report the full genomic DST profile. So these predictions are actually made from, as I mentioned, the TBDB database, or the repository, which is publicly available. And it's made out of more than 2,000 possible mutations. And it's a great resource because I think there are quite a lot of TB researchers and scientists and public health scientists that are actually using this database. And this database is constantly being built and updated. So it is not a static database, as we highlight, and it gets updated from time to time. And also, we also always highlight that, you still need your phenotypic DST to complement your genomic DST, as we cannot detect novel and uncharacterized mutations. So just to give you an example of a case whereby we used whole genome sequencing to solve some of these drug-resistant or suspect drug-resistant cases, we actually had a case previously where there were 2 patients. So patient A actually was sensitive to, HR, the first few first-line TP drugs, but for some reason, pyrazinamide had not been done for this patient A, and he was started on the standard HRZE regimen. And 2 months later, I think they saw that he was not responding well, so they decided to change his drug regimen. And then for patient B, he was actually sensitive to HRE, and he was preliminary resistant to pyrazinamide. And so he was actually started on a non-PZA regimen. But there was actually some concerns because patient B turned out to be patient A's housemate. So there was concern that these 2 cases were actually epidemiologically linked and genetically linked. So we got a request from the clinicians to find out if there were any mutations that could account for the PZA resistant in patient A sample, and to determine whether patient A would actually continue on a PZA based or a non-PZA regimen, because, as I said, patient B's result actually suggested that he was actually preliminary resistant and he had an epi link to patient A. So it turned out, after whole genome sequencing investigation, it was quite interesting because you expect the 2 cases, the isolates, to be linked, but both isolates were actually found to be unrelated via whole genome sequencing, even though there was an epidemiological link. But they had 2, and they were also of 2 different lineages, and they also had very different point mutations in mutations associated with pyrazinamide. So this is a demonstration whereby the genomic DST prediction were distinct for both cases, and they also complement and support the PDST findings. And because of these findings, both cases were actually subjected to different clinical management. So here we show you a summary of some of the PDST, GDST correlation that we have been doing, because I think in the earlier part of my presentation, I highlighted that the labs actually and the National TB Program actually send the phenotypic DST profiles for all these isolates that we sequence back to us. So we have been able to do some sort of correlation of how well the phenotypic DST actually matches the genotypic DST prediction. And it's quite interesting to note that basically we generally good concordance for the first 4-line drugs, but we do notice that there's a dip in sensitivity for pyrazinamide, and also for rifampicin, the positive predictive value is also not as high as we thought. And also for ethambutol, it's very poor positive predictive value. And these are probably, just these are teething issues that have to be sorted out. And also it probably has to do with the differences in it probably has to do with the fact that for midget testing, we and drug susceptibility, phenotypic drug susceptibility testing, we know that there are some issues, for example, for pyrazinamide and ethambutol, whereby phenotypic drug susceptibility testing has been challenging, not particularly reproducible. So yeah. So the prediction, these are the outcomes that have came out. So we have been able to provide standardized genomic DST reports to the NTBP and the TB labs. We have this correlation of, phenotypic and genotypic data. So that gives us a certain level of confidence when we report our data. And then, as I mentioned, because of we start to see, some differences in correlation, that some differences in correlation for certain drugs, and all these can be subject to periodic reviews of the data. So we're actually, in discussion with the hospital diagnostic labs to discuss the different, genotypic the different phenotypic methods that are used by both labs. Could that be one of the reasons for the difference that we see in, the phenotypic versus genotypic, and the way we call our genotypic? Could it be improved? Can it be refined? So I think this is not not something that is for correlation. It's not something to be done by a single lab. It has to involve, all the parties that are involved. So it will involve the discussion between the labs that are actually doing the phenotypic DST and also us that's doing the genomic DST. And then to assess whether there's clinical utility for this genomic DST prediction. So increasingly, we get a lot of requests from clinicians for all these MDR-TB cases, whether they can find out more, make more drug predictions for MDR-TB cases, as this will guide the way they do their clinical treatment. And we have also handled unusual and special cases upon request. So I'll go on to the second part, which is the clustering analysis. The objective is really to detect possible TB transmission clusters, to support any TB outbreak investigations in Singapore, and to characterize the national epidemiology of TB. So for this, you follow the clustering pipeline. So there's still variant calling. After variant calling, we apply certain filters. So we actually exclude the resistance genes and the high change regions of the genome, which have actually poor confidence because they are very GC rich. So we call this, for TB, it's quite renowned that it has this high proportion of, they call PE and PPE regions, and these regions are actually very GC rich, and usually we will filter out these areas as they are very error prone. Then we'll do the variant calling with filters, and then we'll do comparative SNP analysis across all the samples, and then we'll do the clustering and phylogenetic analysis. So this, just to give you a rough idea of the TB distribution, the phylogeny in Singapore. So yeah, actually, most of our TB are actually, almost half of them are actually lineage 2 TB, and followed by lineage 1, and then lineage 4 and lineage 3. And we have a very, very, very small proportion of mixed lineages as well. So cluster investigations are based on SNP threshold. So we define whole genome sequencing clusters by SNP thresholds, which can be ranged from anything from 7 SNPs to 12 SNPs. And we identify these clusters and annotate them by giving them, reference numbers, so that when we discuss these clusters with the National TB program people, they know which are the same which clusters we're referring to. So these clusters are annotated, and then we do the program. The NTBP will actually do an epidemiological review of the whole genome sequencing clusters. By experience, we have found that it's actually easier to exclude. In other words, when we detect 2 isolates, for example, that are not related by whole genome sequencing, versus 2 isolates that are related, it's much easier to say with confidence that, okay, the 2 that are not related are definitely not related. But when we detect 2 isolates that are very closely related genetically, there needs to be epidemiological review to check whether, is there true transmission. And this is in partly due to the TB's inherently very stable genome, because TB actually is a disease that has been around for ages. I mean, it's actually one of the oldest diseases in the world, right? And the genome is actually very stable. The average mutation rate has been found to be about only 0.3 to 0.5 SNPs per genome per year. So while that makes it, very good for ideal for whole, it's kind of like a double-edged sword, because it has been shown very nice applications for whole genome sequencing, but it's also so similar that when you detect genetically linked isolate, sometimes there is no epidemiological data evidence to back up that these 2 are really there was a possible transmission link between these 2 cases. So yeah, here basically what I put here is basically a suspected cluster with epilinks. It's easy to confirm as unrelated if whole genome sequencing suggests that they're not related, but a cryptic cluster detected via whole genome sequencing with no known links can only suggest that there was suspected transmission, and there always is required further epidemiological investigation to verify this transmission. So there have also been many papers that studied the different SNP thresholds to apply to detect a cluster. And different countries have different, SNP thresholds, whereby they found that, and I think it would actually apply very differently for a country with very low TB rates versus a country with, for example, in Singapore, endemic TB. So previous studies have found, when they looked at their data in, I think the Walker and the Meehan papers, they have actually found that a 12 SNP cutoff seems to detect estimated time frame transmission of 24 years. In other words, detecting 2 isolates with a SNP difference of, say, 12 just suggests that transmission could have happened anytime in between those 24 years. So basically, the tighter your SNP threshold is, the higher the probability of actual transmission having happened. But yet, if you make your SNP threshold too high, too high, you may if your SNP threshold is too big, you might end up too low, you might end up missing clusters as well. So it's actually a very fine balance. So I will also share some of the examples whereby whole genome sequencing has came in useful for the cluster and epidemiological investigations for TB. So like a few years back when we just started, there was actually a suspected coffee shop cluster in 2019. And initially there was no suspected link, but when these cases were found to be linked, and the epidemiological team actually went to look deeper into the history of the travel history and the interview findings of these cases. And they found that actually 2 of the cases had actually visited the same coffee shop in Singapore. And then they started to re-interview the other cases that had been found to be linked to the same genetic cluster, using the information, the realization that, using this coffee shop as the common link. And they found that when they re-interviewed these cases, they realized that actually it turned out it's not just 2, but I think 4 or 5 of the cases had actually been to the same coffee shop. But it's not the question that a public health officer might be able to intuitively ask, because obviously we don't ask for every single detail for a TB patient. The epidemiological questions are usually quite standard. So having the whole genome sequencing result actually enabled them to give more targeted questions to confirm the suspected link. And it also led to screening of all the storeholders at the coffee shop, and they found an attack rate of 21%. Whole genome sequencing has also been proven to be quite useful. So you can see for here, this was the first one of the very first TB clusters that were identified, whereby whole genome sequencing had been very useful, because they found that they found a cluster of TB cases at public housing blocks, and as they dug deeper and they did further screening, they found that actually there were 6 genetically identical MDR TB cases, which had no apparent epidemiological links, but most of them actually stayed in the same public housing block or had been around the area. So this was one case whereby whole genome sequencing had been very useful to find these cases. And then when we first took over the whole genome sequencing program in 2020, there were also these particular cases whereby, again, it was another HDB cluster. 4 cases, I think at the beginning it was just 2 cases that were detected. They stayed in the same block. And later when the 3rd case popped up, they realized that, hey, there seems to be some transmission that's been happening in this block. But the strange thing was that most of these cases, while they stayed in the same block, they were actually not close contacts of each other. But anyway, regardless, the detection of these 4 cases in the same block that were genetically identical actually led our Ministry of Health to trigger and activate mass screening for this particular block. And then I share another interesting TB cluster that happened at a betting center in Singapore. So what happened was there were actually quite a few TB cases that have been found to have been visited this particular betting center in Singapore that's located in the Bedok area. And as we sequence more and more isolates, we found that actually many of the cases had actually some sort of direct epidemiological link. They had all visited the same Singapore pool clusters, but we also had quite a few cases that were they did not visit the same betting center, but they had some sort of probable link by the addresses and places visited. For example, they had gone to they had gone to a coffee shop nearby, or they had hung out in the similar area, or they had no recollection. So the epidemiological, when we overlay the epidemiological information together with the genetic analysis, we actually start to see a very clear picture of the Singapore pools cluster emerging. And what was interesting about this particular whole genome sequence, this particular WGS cluster, was also that it was actually made out of 2 separate Miru. So if you recall, Miru is actually the older method of genotyping. It's a low resolution, and by Miru, actually a few of the cases were actually found to be different, of a different Miru type. But by whole genome sequencing, we found that actually these cases were actually all genetically identical. And what was also very interesting was there were actually quite a few other cases of TB cases at the same Singapore Pools outlet, but they were actually genetically different to this particular cluster. So it actually suggests that there were actually 2 separate whole genome sequencing clusters that were linked to the same venue. So it actually suggests that there were actually 2 transmission chains happening at the betting center at that point in time. So I hope I have demonstrated to you how useful whole genome sequencing has been for our country. It provides increased resolution over the previous genotyping methods that were used in detecting and characterizing these TB clusters. And you optimize the resources for any additional public health action required. It has expanded contact tracing where relevant. It has triggered mass screening exercises at places which really only require mass screening, as we know that these are very resource heavy exercises. And the epidemiological investigations, as I mentioned, they're actually essential and very important to verify these whole genome sequencing as clusters as true transmission clusters. And we are also undertaking a review of what is the best SNP threshold to use at this point in time. As I mentioned, that different studies have actually different SNP thresholds. So we're actually overlaying our clusters now with the epidemiological data to see what really is the best SNP threshold to use to call and conclude and detect, a WGS cluster. We've also shown that whole genome sequencing has helped to detect transmission clusters beyond the usual contact tracing methods. It has identified transmission among strangers in a common venue. We also starting to notice that, you have transmission in uncommon or unusual settings, not expected of that for TB, and also we start to characterize these novel TB transmission patterns. For example, I think the idea of, detecting TB and realizing that 4 cases which had never been in contact with each other in the same HDB block, but yet were genetically identical, suggests that there's definitely has been some sort of transmission, but they couldn't be picked up by epidemiological investigations. And without the whole genome sequencing, there's probably no clear best way to show that these cases were really genetically linked. It also supports epidemiological investigation challenges for outbreak confirmation. So, in cases whereby patients were unable or unwilling to volunteer information, using the whole genome sequencing results have helped them guided, our NTBP colleagues in reinvestigating and re-interviewing these particular cases. Then something else we have shown for whole genome sequencing for TB is also to do monitoring of BCG vaccine adverse event following immunization. So I think there was some increased observations of BCG-associated adverse events for certain BCG vaccine strains, and samples have been sent to NPHL for vaccine strain identification, and we compared. So because it's also quite challenging in a sense, because BCG is actually, the differences in between the strains are actually just characterized by deletions. So we have to compare the deletions that are present in each sample that are unique for each BCG vaccine strain. So you can confirm, for example, that a BCG adverse event, a particular case, had it really been infected by the same BCG vaccine strain that the case had been given initially. So besides that, it's also important to share the challenges and the curveballs that we have been through. So on our experience, we find that actually being sort of, we're actually, although we do the bulk of the whole genome sequencing, we call this garbage in, garbage out. What if we get rubbish to sequence, we will basically sequence rubbish. So there's really nothing much we can do on that end, but to ask the diagnostic laboratories to send us sample, could you please re-extract the sample? So DNA quality is actually a very important factor because it determines how well, how good the quality of our sequencing results will be. And then, as I mentioned, we've had to deal with NTMs, contaminated TB samples that are contaminated with TB reads. Sometimes they are contaminated with 10% of non-TB reads. Sometimes they're contaminated with 80% of TB reads, and we have to make a judgment call because for whole genome sequencing, it's of high precision. So there will definitely be some sort of contamination. And where is the threshold to call as a, when do we continue? When do we remove this from the sample from analysis? Or when do we continue with the analysis? So we have to make sort of a judgment call on, what is true contamination and what isn't. And then we have the questions on mixed infections. And we also know that TB can also be subject to what we call heteroresistance. So we have, rare cases whereby, for example, you can see on the picture here, you have isolates that carry mixed reads. 20% of the reads actually carry this particular mutation, but the other 80% are actually wild types. So in such cases, how do we report and inform clinicians to guide them to make an informed decision? And something else which has been in discussion, but we have not explored much, is also the direct sequencing of clinical samples for samples which are non-culturable, etc. So just these are some of the challenges, and there's actually a long list, but these are just some of the major ones that I share. So in conclusion, we have demonstrated that the real-time whole genome sequencing of all culture-positive TB in Singapore has actually enabled genomic DST prediction and phylogenetic surveillance for all the TB cases in Singapore. And we've shown that the GDST prediction actually complements existing PDST testing to aid the clinical decisions, especially for multi-drug resistant TB cases. We have used WGS to characterize any ongoing TB transmission networks. It has also been useful to detect cryptic, or silent TB clusters with the possibility to infer novel TB transmission patterns, and also for targeted contact tracing and public health intervention. We also have increased resolution both for drug susceptibility testing and transmission clusters, and we do surveillance for the MDR and XDR cases. And finally, we also use this to do the BCG vaccine strain monitoring, as I have shown. So yeah, I would like to acknowledge our partners which we work very closely with. So the National TB Program, definitely, and the TBCU. So these are as I mentioned, this is the epidemiological and clinical arm of the TB unit in Singapore. And then the NPHL, the bacteriology team, who's provided a lot of support to the TB site in the NPHL TB team in doing the analysis, in doing the daily operations and setting up of the TB workflow. And then the Central TB Lab and the NUH TB Lab, which are the two main diagnostic labs in Singapore for TB, and also to the research labs that's actually started the sequencing at the beginning, the very beginning, when TB whole genome sequencing actually started off as research before it was actually gradually transitioned into a national program. So with that, I have come to the end of my presentation. I hope I have not overspoken by too long. Yeah, thank you very much for listening, and I'm happy to accept any questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Michelle. Okay, is there any question from our webmate? Okay, Dr. Michelle, before that, I would like, can I ask you a few questions regarding related to the like outbreak or looking for the cluster?
Sure.
Okay, actually, just now we are talking about the coffee shop and the housing block, everything. How actually you started your WGS? Are you using the clinical samples, direct clinical samples, or you need to culture first? Because it's not easy for us to convince the public to get the samples actually.
So these were actually, so for now, everything that we're doing is actually based on isolate. So they're actually all based on cultures. There are a lot of challenges with direct sequencing of clinical samples. So yeah, actually all these are based on isolate. So as I mentioned, maybe just let me go to the slides at the beginning. Just one second. So you can see here that basically the labs will send the DNA extracted from the cultures and then send it to NPHL for the sequencing.
So for all the sample, you will perform the phenotypic also. Then after that, also you will send for the.
So no, so all these so NPHL only handles the whole genome sequencing aspect. The phenotypic is actually done at the BSL-3 the TB laboratories. Because we don't have the BSL-3
Special
the
one.
facility, it needs BSL-3 facilities specific for TB phenotypic DST. So we have a BSL-3 laboratory at the moment, but as these are already being done at the diagnostic laboratories, so it's the diagnostic laboratories that actually do it as part of their standard laboratory workup.
Okay. Actually, it's interesting if you can perform WGS especially for the cluster, because as you show, there's now there may be the two person there, but with a different strain or from the different resources actually.
Yes, that is right. So the knowledge of the whether two isolates are genetically linked has actually, I think, helped very much the epidemiological team in terms of the confidence on whether should we embark further on the investigation of these two cases, or can we just stop the investigation. So it actually saved a lot of time for them, so that they can redirect their resources to do other investigations for more relevant cases.
Sure.
So I see a question from Dawn. How do you define TB cluster using whole genome sequencing? So the TB cluster, as I mentioned, are actually defined by SNP thresholds. So in other words, we look at the entire genome, the TB genome, and we exclude certain high change regions. So you could say we're looking at it in totality, but we are removing a small percentage of the genomes that are subject to high genomic change, as this might affect the results. It will be considered as in totality, and then we apply a SNP threshold of either 7 SNPs or 12 SNPs. So in the past, we used to apply a 12 SNP threshold. In other words, any isolates that is 12 SNPs or less to each other would be defined as a whole genome sequencing cluster, as a WGS cluster. And any out of that would be we call them ungrouped.
Okay.
I hope that answers the
Okay, the other question also looking for what's the cost like for WGS in terms of dollar and time in comparison with classical genotyping from Don also.
So sorry, I cannot really comment in terms of dollars because we are more the operational side.
How about the time? How long you will take the thing, everything? Just now you have to share with it just now.
Yes, so we shared a little bit on the timeline. We do our whole genome sequencing on a weekly basis, and then we would usually return the results back also on a weekly basis. So for example, so the samples obviously are batched up. We receive samples in batches, and then we run them in the same week that we receive them, and then we return the results usually by the following week or the week after.
Okay, then question from One is Micro. Hi, Dr. Michelle. What type of clinical specimen have your team successfully run with WGS? How do you decontam those specimens? Thank you for sharing and read.
Thank you. We have tried a CSF sample before. That was a special request, but we were actually very unsuccessful. We detected a very, very low number of TB reads for it. I think it was like 0.0000001% of TB reads. So the reads were basically unusable because for clinical specimens, obviously it would be flooded, contaminated with human reads. So I think for clinical specimen, we still need to explore. There's a lot more to do and look at in terms of direct clinical specimen WGS. In my opinion, it will probably make more sense to do for such cases a targeted whole genome sequencing. In other words, you amplify only the regions that you are really interested to look at. And I guess this would mostly be useful for cases whereby you cannot get cultures, and it's a suspect drug resistant case, so you would want to use, I believe there are some commercial kits available out there that can support whole genome sequencing. So they will amplify certain drug resistant regions of target regions known to be associated with drug resistance, and then they put this in for whole genome sequencing. In other words, we're calling this amplicon-based whole genome, amplicon-based NGS. Yeah. So I think there's a kit called the Diplex, if I'm not wrong, that they have explored. Although I've heard of it, but I've never looked at it in detail. But
there's more to
this is one of the possible. Sorry.
There's more to genotypic. They're more to the certain gene only.
Yes. This is in answer to the question for sequencing of direct sequencing of clinical specimens. Yeah.
So next question from Fairuz. Dr. Michelle, may I know your opinion about usage of WGS in detecting MDR-TB compared to conventional method, which takes longer time to get the results? Your opinion.
My opinion is, well, to be honest, I am actually not at the, in the diagnostic lab itself.
Okay.
But I do know, based on my experience previously, that MDR-TB can be very challenging. Phenotypically, it can also be challenging, especially as I mentioned, for certain drugs like pyrazinamide. There's some reproducibility issues. And I think there's still some disagreement for certain TB drugs in terms of the cutoff. What's the best cutoff to set? Like, the break point MICs. There's still some there's some no clear agreement on what's the best break point to set for drug concentration. So whole genome sequencing is useful in the sense that by giving you a point mutation with the confidence that kind of supports
There is still
whatever
the
finding
loop
you
there.
have. Sorry?
There's still the gap that we still cannot use WGS
Yes.
100%. We
Yes,
still need to
of course.
validate and we
Of
still need to
course.
evaluate the
Yeah.
thing again.
Yeah, so it is a complementation of both. I would say that the time might be there is a lot of potential for whole genome sequencing to be faster to detect a MDR-TB compared to conventional phenotypic DST. There is potential, but because for now we batch our samples up, we may not be as fast, to be honest. Although we have told we work very closely with the National TB program and the clinicians. So we do tell those labs, like, if you have a suspect MDR case that requires urgent, like faster processing, let us know, and then we'll try to put it in and process it as soon as possible and give the result as soon as possible, rather than a weekly update. Yeah.
We are looking forward for that. Okay, the next question from admin here. What's a library preparation kit used for TB? Library preparation kit used for TB?
So the library prep kit is not specific to TB. It can be used for preparation of any bacterial whole genome sequencing, because we actually use the same kit for all our other bacteria WGS as well. The one we're currently using is usually the Illumina Nextera XT. Yeah, but I believe that you can actually use a lot. There are many different options out there in the market, so it's just about selecting one and validating the one that works best for you.
We have to validate first, then we can use it.
Of course, yes.
Okay, Dr. Michelle, there's next question from Dawn. In the cases of WGS clustered but non-cluster using Miru VNTR, were they clonal complex cluster perhaps? Is there any?
For this, I cannot answer per se, because I'm not entirely sure how we define clonal complex clusters for TB. I don't think there's a very clear, if we look at the MLST profiles for TB, because they are so homogeneous, they are so similar in a sense, I don't think it's very clearly defined. So I'm afraid I can't really answer that question. Yeah. But it's probably, I think if we look at the repeats patterns for the Miru, they will probably have, they're probably quite similar and just small differences in certain repeats.
Okay. So Don, Don, next question. Do you see any specific trends for the RTB, especially isoniazid and rifampicin resistant, that's unique to Singapore?
We do notice, I don't know whether it's unique to Singapore, but we do notice certain mutations that we do not see in the usual, in the standard, WHO catalog. And we're not too sure what's the significance of these particular mutations. But I don't think there's something that's particularly, unique to Singapore. Also because the isolates that we get we have residents and non-residents. So, we have an influx of migrants as well. So the isolates that we're getting is it could be from anybody. So we can't really get a clear trend for that sense. We don't look specifically at, the mutations for Singaporeans. I mean, sorry, for Singapore residents versus the non-residents. Although that's something that we were actually discussing with the NTBB program to look into. Yes.
Okay, maybe that is the last question actually. So any more questions? Okay, Dr. Michelle, if anybody want to ask any question in future, can they contact you?
Yes, sure. And I'll be happy to try and answer them to the best of my ability.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Michelle. I think we have a lot of things we gained from this talk today. It's a great talk actually. We are really thankful to you, and we are really appreciate all the questions they answered by you, and we hope we can meet again in next, maybe with a more challenging topic. Okay. So with this, I think we can end up our session today. It should be ended at 4 o'clock, but still there's no other question. So do you have anything else to tell us?
Not really. I think yeah. Just happy to be able to, share the experience. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Michelle. With this, we end up our session today. So thank you very much to everybody. So see you again in next session from myself, Zulaika Muhammad. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi taala wabarakatuh.